12. That's the number we're working with today. And the reason it's 12 and not 10 or 15 matters more than you'd think. Every ocean has a choke point, a place where geography squeezes shipping lanes down to something narrower than anyone would like. And most of those places are fine. Ships pass through, nothing happens, everyone moves on. But there's a small set of passages around the world where geography, weather, traffic, and sometimes open conflict all stack on top of each other. And the result is a stretch of water that modern ships with satellite navigation, weather radar, and hulls that would have looked like science fiction 100 years ago still approach the way a driver approaches a mountain pass in a snowstorm. Carefully. Sometimes not at all. These aren't scary places gathered for the sake of being scary. Every entry earns its spot through something you can actually measure: how often things go wrong there, how severe the forces involved really are, how much modern technology can or can't reduce the risk, and how much danger simply refuses to be engineered away. Put a placid strait with heavy traffic next to a remote passage with almost no traffic but sustained hurricane-force wind, and you start to notice that dangerous isn't one thing. It's several different problems wearing the same word, and treating them as interchangeable puts the wrong places at the top. Think about what actually happens every time you order something online and it arrives a week later on a truck. Somewhere behind that delivery, almost certainly, a ship carrying a shipping container passed through at least one of these 12 stretches of water, and the captain and crew on that ship made a series of decisions about speed, timing, and route that had almost nothing to do with your package, and everything to do with staying alive through a particular few miles of ocean. That's the part of global trade nobody puts on the packaging. So we're going to move through 12 of these passages, starting with the one where danger is mostly a math problem, thousands of vessels sharing too little water, and ending with the one place on the planet where the ocean itself, completely unimpressed by any of our engineering, still runs the show. Along the way, the ranking is going to force some uncomfortable comparisons. Is a strait with constant near misses more dangerous than one with a single catastrophic wreck every decade or so? Is a passage that kills through deliberate human violence worse than one that kills through pure physics, even if the physics kills more people over time? There's a real argument either way. And by the end, you'll have enough evidence to make your own case, possibly a different one than the case laid out here. One more thing before we start moving, because the criteria matter more than the drama. The order here reflects 4 things working together: how often incidents happen, how severe the forces involved are when something does go wrong, how effective modern mitigation has actually proven to be, and how much risk is left over even after every reasonable precaution has been taken. A passage can be genuinely terrifying to sail through and still rank low if humans have figured out how to manage the danger with rules, monitoring, and equipment, the way an active volcano next door to a well-built city is less of a daily threat than a fault line nobody's mapped yet. A passage can look calm on a chart, barely worth a second glance, and still rank near the top if the danger inside it can't be trained, regulated, or engineered away. Keep that distinction in mind. It's the thread that connects everything that follows, and it's why a place with far fewer recorded wrecks can still outrank a place with a long, grim casualty list. It's also worth being upfront that not everyone who studies these waters for a living would rank them in exactly this order. A marine insurer pricing risk day-to-day would likely weight incident frequency far more heavily than this approach does. A naval strategist would weight geopolitical exposure higher still. This particular ranking weights all 4 criteria roughly evenly and leans toward irreducibility as the tiebreaker whenever 2 passages are otherwise close, which is a defensible choice and not the only one available. We start in the English Channel at its narrowest point, where England and France close in on each other until only about 21 miles of water separate Dover from Cap Gris-Nez. This is the mildest entry on the list. That doesn't mean it's safe in any absolute sense. It means almost everything dangerous about this stretch of water has a name, a rule, and a control room watching it happen in real time, which is more than can be said for most of the entries still to come. Here's the number that explains why the Dover Strait is dangerous at all. Somewhere in the range of 400 to 600 commercial vessels cross it on an average day. Ferries, container ships, tankers, fishing boats, all converging on a stretch of water narrow enough that you can stand on the cliffs above Dover and see France on a clear afternoon, though nobody sane would try to swim it with that kind of traffic overhead. The mix matters as much as the count. A modern container ship or crude carrier moving at normal transit speed needs the better part of a mile and several long minutes to bring itself to a full stop, even with engines thrown hard into reverse. And turning is barely faster, since a hull that size responds to the helm on a delay measured in ship lengths, not seconds. Put several dozen vessels with that kind of stopping distance on intersecting courses in a channel you can see across, and the margin for error left over for two ships to avoid each other, after accounting for reaction time, radio confirmation, and the physical time it actually takes a loaded hull to change course, gets uncomfortably thin without a system imposing order from outside. Port of Dover alone handles something on the order of 140 billion pounds worth of trade every year, roughly a third of everything the United Kingdom trades in goods with the European Union. Moving across a body of water most of that cargo's owners will never once think about. It's one of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet, and it runs straight into a second problem baked into the geography. The English Channel funnels traffic east and west along its length, while ferries need to cross north and south to get from England to the continent. Picture two highways crossing at street level with no traffic light, except the vehicles weigh tens of thousands of tons and need the better part of a mile just to stop. This strait wasn't always this carefully managed, and the story of how it became the most tightly regulated of these 12 passages starts with a genuinely bad month. On the 11th of January, 1971, thick fog sat over the strait when the Peruvian freighter Paracas, cutting inside the shipping lanes along the English coast rather than following the proper route, struck the Panamanian tanker Texaco Caribbean. The tanker split apart and sank, killing 8 of her crew, and left a wreck sitting just below the surface, near the Varn Bank. The following day, the West German freighter Brandenburg struck that same submerged wreck and went down within minutes, killing 21 of her 32 crew, despite British authorities having already marked the site with warning lights. 6 weeks later, on the 27th of February, a third vessel, the Greek ship Nike, hit the same wreck site and sank with her entire crew still aboard, despite lightships and marker buoys that had, by then, been placed directly over the hazard specifically to prevent exactly this outcome. 3 ships lost at essentially the same spot inside 7 weeks, 2 of them hitting a wreck that was already marked, is the kind of statistic that ends careers and rewrites regulations, and it did both. The response to that disaster is one of the quiet success stories of maritime safety, and it's worth explaining because it's what effective mitigation actually looks like when a system finally gets taken seriously. A traffic separation scheme for the Dover Strait, essentially a set of lanes, like a highway system laid over open water, with eastbound traffic on one side and westbound on the other, split by a buffer zone in between, had technically existed since 1967, making it the first such scheme the International Maritime Organization ever approved anywhere in the world. But the Varn Bank disaster exposed how little enforcement backed it up. Ships routinely ignored the lanes when it saved time, exactly the way the Paracas had. What followed was a tightening of the entire system, mandatory reporting, active radar monitoring, and eventually the legal authority to prosecute vessels caught cutting corners, turning a scheme that had existed mostly on paper into one that actually shaped where ships sailed. Coast Guard stations on both the English and French sides now run continuous radar coverage of the strait, identifying vessels, tracking their courses, and radioing warnings the moment something drifts into the wrong lane or closes too fast on another ship. This is the Channel Navigation Information Service, backed up by AIS, the automatic identification system that broadcasts a ship's position, speed, and heading to everyone within range. This strait has carried more than commerce, too. Between the 26th of May and the 4th of June, 1940, roughly 700 small boats, fishing trawlers, pleasure craft, lifeboats, some barely 18 feet long, crossed this same stretch of water as part of Operation Dynamo, ferrying more than 300,000 trapped Allied soldiers off the beaches at Dunkirk and back to England under German air attack. It's a reminder that the strait's narrowness, the exact feature that makes it so dangerous to navigate safely today, is also what has made it historically valuable in ways that have nothing to do with trade at all. Inside the control rooms themselves, on both the English and French coasts, operators watch banks of radar screens tracking every vessel in the strait simultaneously, cross-referencing each contact against its AIS transponder data, and stepping in by radio the moment a course looks wrong. Whether that means a fishing boat drifting into the separation zone or a container ship's watch officer who's clearly not responding to hails. It's unglamorous, repetitive work, hour after hour of green blips moving in orderly lines, right up until one blip stops moving in an orderly line. And the entire reason those control rooms exist is that Warnbank proved what happens when nobody's watching closely enough. An officer on watch through the Dover Strait today has more real-time information about every other vessel nearby than most military commanders had about enemy movements for most of the 20th century, and it shows in the numbers. Collisions in the strait dropped sharply once enforcement caught up with the rules on paper, and they've kept dropping as radar coverage, mandatory reporting, and now satellite-linked tracking have layered on top of the original system. None of the passages still ahead will get that same second and third strike within a single winter. Dover got its warning early, paid for it in lives, and then actually fixed the underlying problem, which is rarer than it should be in maritime history and worth flagging before moving on to passages that never got quite as lucky or quite as fixable. A near miss here today plays out fast and almost entirely on instruments. A fishing vessel drifts a few hundred meters into the separation zone chasing a shoal it's been tracking on its own sonar, ignoring the crossing lane's boundary because the fish don't care where the line is drawn. A container ship on autopilot in the adjacent lane picks up the contact on radar, and the watch officer has maybe 90 seconds to decide whether it's closing on a collision course or simply passing close, radio the Coast Guard, alter course if needed, and confirm the new heading, all before the two vessels are anywhere near touching distance. Most of the time, that 90 seconds is plenty. The entire point of everything built into this strait since 1971 is making sure it stays that way, even on the day it almost isn't. What's left over, the residual risk no traffic scheme fully erases, comes down to human error and the cross-channel ferries, which still have to cut across the separation lanes to get from an English port to a French one. Every ferry crossing is, structurally, a controlled violation of the general flow of traffic, threading a gap between container ships doing better than 20 knots. It works because everyone follows the rules and everyone is watching everyone else. It's also why, when something does go wrong here, in fog, in a moment of miscommunication, in an autopilot left engaged a beat too long, it tends to happen fast and close to shore, with rescue services minutes away rather than hours. That's why Dover sits at the bottom among these 12. Not risk-free, and the Warnbank proves it never has been. Just the most thoroughly managed danger on the list, built on the back of a disaster nobody wants repeated. Move south and west past Spain to the gate between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. At its narrowest, the Strait of Gibraltar is about 9 miles across, close enough that on a clear day, you can see the coast of Morocco from the Rock of Gibraltar and the coast of Spain from Tangier at the same time. It looks from a map like the easiest crossing on this entire list. Ancient Greek sailors called the twin headlands flanking it the Pillars of Hercules, believed for centuries to mark the literal edge of the known world, the point beyond which, according to the warning inscribed on old maps, there was nothing left to sail toward. The reason this crossing isn't as easy as it looks has less to do with traffic and more to do with what the water itself is doing underneath the surface, a mechanism none of the passages so far have involved. The Mediterranean is a hot, evaporation-heavy sea that loses more water to the sun than all its rivers put back in. The Atlantic is cooler and less salty by comparison. That imbalance drives a two-layer exchange through the strait. Warmer, less dense Atlantic water flows in along the surface, while colder, saltier, denser Mediterranean water sinks and flows back out along the bottom, through the same narrow gap, in the opposite direction. Two rivers of ocean, stacked on top of each other, moving different directions through a space 9 miles wide. A shallow underwater ridge called the Cameronal Sill, sitting where the strait narrows on its western side, makes the exchange even more turbulent than the basic two-layer picture suggests, generating what oceanographers call internal waves, enormous underwater swells moving through the boundary between the two water layers rather than at the surface, sometimes over 300 feet tall, measured from crest to trough, invisible to anyone looking at the surface, but powerful enough to be tracked from satellites by the ripple patterns they leave behind. Add in surface tidal currents that can run past 3 knots, unpredictable fog that rolls in fast off the Atlantic side, and a funnel effect that accelerates wind through the strait well beyond what's blowing a few miles out on open water, and you get a passage where the physics alone would justify a ranking above Dover, even before you add the sheer volume of traffic crossing it, since Gibraltar handles a large share of the shipping moving between Europe, the Mediterranean, and everywhere east of Suez. That same narrow gap happens to be one of the main migration corridors fin whales use to move between Atlantic feeding grounds and the Mediterranean, passing through between roughly November and April each year, directly across the same shipping lanes, carrying that traffic. And researchers tracking collision injuries have identified the strait as one of the clearest hotspots anywhere in European waters, where whale and ships simply occupy the same patch of water at the same time far too often for comfort. The layered current doesn't just make navigation trickier, it occasionally puts two vessels in the same patch of water at the worst possible moment. In the early hours of the 12th of August 2007, the Panamanian bulk carrier New Flame, having left Gibraltar without proper clearance, collided with the Danish tanker Torm Gertrude, roughly a mile off Europa Point. The New Flame took on water fast, her forward holds flooding until she began sinking by the bow, and her crew of 23 abandoned ship. She never fully went down. She sat there for months, half submerged off one of the busiest headlands in Europe, a hazard to every other vessel navigating past her, until she finally broke in two that December and had to be salvaged in pieces. It's a reminder that even a strait this heavily monitored, sitting at the doorstep of a British overseas territory with round-the-clock traffic control, can still produce a wreck that lingers as its own navigational hazard for months afterward. There's an older layer of danger here too, one that predates engines entirely. For centuries, this strait sat at the crossroads of Barbary corsair raiding routes out of North Africa, European naval rivalries, and the trade fleets everyone was trying to protect or plunder, and the waters just outside it carry that history in their names. Cape Trafalgar sits roughly 40 miles northwest of the strait, and it was there in October of 1805 that a British fleet under Horatio Nelson broke a combined French and Spanish fleet in one of the most consequential naval battles in European history, fought specifically because whoever controlled this stretch of water controlled the door between two oceans and, with it, a meaningful share of European trade and empire. That's the same underlying logic that still makes Gibraltar a choke point worth fighting over today. Just with container ships standing in for ships of the line. And it's a big part of why Gibraltar itself has remained a British overseas territory, with a working Royal Navy base still tucked into its harbor, centuries after Spain first ceded it in 1713. Nobody who has actually controlled this rock has ever wanted to give it up voluntarily. But the traffic isn't the whole story here, and it would be dishonest to rank Gibraltar without naming the other kind of crossing that happens on this water. The same 9 miles that carry container ships and tankers also carry small, overloaded boats attempting an irregular crossing from Morocco toward Spain. And that crossing kills people every year. The International Organization for Migration's Missing Migrants Project, which has tracked deaths on migration routes worldwide since 2014, has documented dozens of confirmed deaths, specifically on the Gibraltar crossing, with researchers explicit that the real number sits above whatever gets confirmed, since boats that simply vanish in strong currents and fog leave no formal record at all. The nearby Alboran Sea crossing, a bit further east along the same coastline, has recorded even more, and researchers tracking migration deaths across the wider Mediterranean have repeatedly flagged the broader region as one of the deadliest migration corridors anywhere in the world, with total recorded deaths and disappearances across all its routes running into the tens of thousands since organized tracking began in the middle of the 2010s. These aren't shipwrecks in the commercial sense that dominates most of these crossings, but they belong in any honest accounting of what this strait does to people who underestimate it, because the same currents and the same sudden fog that challenge a container ship's officer with radar, satellite weather, and a bridge full of instruments are lethal to a small boat with none of those advantages. Spanish and Moroccan rescue services do intervene when they can, pulling people from overloaded inflatable boats that have lost power or simply come apart in the crossing. And Spanish Maritime Rescue alone responds to incidents along this coast on a near-weekly basis during the calmer sailing months, when crossing attempts spike specifically because the currents are marginally more forgiving. Marginally forgiving is still 9 miles of open water with a 2-layer current running beneath it in opposite directions, in a boat never designed for anything but a calm afternoon close to shore. That's the double character of Gibraltar. For commercial shipping, it's a manageable hazard, well-charted, well-monitored by Spanish and Moroccan traffic services, survivable with competent seamanship and modern equipment, though the new flame shows that even competent seamanship occasionally isn't enough. For the people crossing it in small craft with none of those advantages, it's one of the deadliest 9 miles of water in Europe. Ranking it above Dover comes down to 2 separate facts stacked on top of each other: a layered current system that Dover simply doesn't have, and a human cost that traffic separation schemes were never designed to address in the first place. East from Gibraltar, between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, runs the strait that, more than any other passage covered here, decides how much a container of anything costs by the time it reaches a shelf in North America. Nearly a quarter of the world's seaborne trade moves through the Strait of Malacca, along with something like 24 million barrels of oil a day and roughly 80% of China's energy imports. In 2024 alone, more than 94,000 ships transited the strait, carrying cargo valued at something like $2.8 trillion. That much economic weight sits on top of a channel that, at its narrowest point near Singapore, called the Phillips Channel, is only about 1.7 miles wide, and at its shallowest runs as little as 25 to 27 meters deep, which sounds like plenty until you remember that fully loaded supertankers can draw close to that depth themselves, leaving almost no margin for error. Naval architects even build to this constraint deliberately, and the industry has a name for it. A Malaccamax vessel is one designed at the absolute upper limit of what this strait's depth allows. Something in the neighborhood of a 300,000 deadweight ton crude carrier with a draft right around 20 meters. engineered specifically so it can still clear the shallowest stretch of this channel with only a few meters of water separating the hull from the seabed. Very few other straits on Earth are important enough to have an entire class of ship named after the exact width of their margin for error. This water has decided military outcomes as well as commercial ones, and not only in the distant past. In May of 1945, in one of the last major surface naval engagements of the Second World War, British destroyers ambushed the Japanese cruiser Haguro in heavy rain and darkness at the northern end of the strait, sinking her with the loss of over 900 Japanese sailors against 2 British dead, an action fought specifically because control of this exact channel meant control of Japan's ability to resupply and evacuate its garrisons across the region. This strait has been worth controlling for so long that entire empires organized themselves around it. The Portuguese seized the port city of Malacca in 1511 under Afonso de Albuquerque, recognizing correctly that whoever held the narrowest crossing point could tax and control the spice trade flowing between India, China, and the Indonesian archipelago. The Dutch took it from them in 1641, and the British eventually absorbed it into the Straits settlements in the 19th century, running Singapore, Malacca, and Penang as a single administrative unit built entirely around control of this shipping lane. None of those powers were fighting over the water itself. They were fighting over the fact that almost nothing moving between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific could avoid passing through it, a fact that remains just as true now as it was 500 years ago, only measured in container ships instead of spice galleons. Even the Straits traffic separation scheme, when it was finally implemented, was really just a modern administrative answer to a problem those earlier colonial administrations understood instinctively, without ever writing it down in International Maritime Organization language. Control the choke point, and you control an outsized share of everything that has to pass through it. Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia jointly operate a vessel traffic service across the busiest stretch of the strait, tracking every large vessel by radar and requiring reporting at set checkpoints along the route. Essentially the same philosophy as Dover's separation scheme adapted for a much longer, shallower, and more crowded channel. It works reasonably well for the traffic problem. It doesn't touch the second layer of danger here, which is history refusing to stay in the past. This strait has been a piracy corridor for centuries, back through the era of Malay sultanates and European colonial trading companies fighting over the spice routes, and it never fully stopped. In the early 2000s, Malacca and its surrounding waters accounted for something like 40% of piracy incidents recorded worldwide, enough that insurers briefly classified it as a war risk zone. Coordinated patrols between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, launched in 2004 under what became known as the Malacca Strait Patrols, drove incident numbers down for years afterward. But piracy in these waters has never gone to zero, and recently, it's been climbing again. 62 recorded incidents of piracy and armed robbery against ships in the strait in 2024 rose to over 100 in 2025, a jump of roughly 74% in a single year, according to regional monitoring groups, mostly low-level robbery of anchored or slow-moving vessels rather than the ship-seizing hijackings of decades past, but a real and rising cost of doing business through this water all the same. Some of that pressure comes simply from how much traffic converges here beyond the ships actually transiting the strait. Singapore, sitting at the strait's southeastern doorway, is the world's busiest bunkering port, the place where an enormous share of the vessels using this route stop to refuel, take on supplies, or swap crew, which means the water approaching the strait is crowded not just with ships passing through, but with ships slowing down, anchoring, and maneuvering around each other for entirely separate reasons, layering local congestion on top of the transit traffic itself. By tonnage handled, Singapore has spent years trading places with Shanghai for busiest port in the world, and virtually all of that tonnage has to clear this exact strait first, arriving or departing. which means Malacca's congestion problem and Singapore's status as a global logistics hub are really the same fact, described from two different angles. Piracy isn't even the only thing that periodically strips visibility out of this strait and turns ordinary transits dangerous. Seasonal haze, driven by agricultural and forest fires on Sumatra, has repeatedly blanketed the strait during dry months, cutting visibility to a fraction of a nautical mile at its worst, and forcing vessels to slow dramatically or anchor in place in one of the busiest waterways on Earth. During one especially severe haze episode in the late 1990s, reduced visibility contributed to a serious vessel collision in these waters, and researchers who study the strait's accident record now list haze alongside congestion and shallow depth as one of the recurring conditions behind its collision statistics, a hazard with no fixed season and no reliable forecast window, arriving whenever conditions on land happen to align against everyone downwind on the water. A typical modern piracy incident here looks almost mundane compared with the tanker hijackings of the piracy peak 2 decades ago. A small boat pulls alongside a bulk carrier slowed to a crawl in the traffic separation lane after dark. Several men climb aboard using a hooked pole and rope, and they're gone within 20 minutes with whatever cash was in the ship's safe, and any loose engine spares or equipment they can carry, often before the crew has even finished mustering. It rarely makes international headlines the way a full hijacking would, but multiply that 20-minute intrusion by 100 incidents a year, and it becomes a standing cost every shipping line operating through Malacca has to plan around, in insurance premiums, in crew danger pay, and in the private security patrols some operators now hire specifically for this stretch of the transit. Lloyd's of London and other war risk underwriters periodically reclassify stretches of the strait as elevated risk zones when incident counts spike, a designation that immediately adds a war risk premium on top of ordinary hull and cargo insurance for any vessel transiting during the classification, a cost that ultimately gets passed down the supply chain to whoever eventually buys whatever the ship is carrying. None of it individually makes headlines the way a single hijacked supertanker once did. All of it together is exactly the kind of grinding, cumulative risk that a pure incident count can undersell if you're not looking closely at what each of those incidents actually costs. What makes Malacca a genuinely different mechanism than anything covered so far is where the danger actually sits. At Dover, danger is one thing colliding with another. At Gibraltar, it's a current system running beneath the surface. Here, it's closer to a choke point problem in the economic sense as much as the physical one. A grounding, a serious collision, or a sustained piracy campaign in the Phillips Channel doesn't just threaten the ships involved. It threatens to back up a meaningful percentage of world trade behind a single narrow gap, the same way a blocked highway lane backs up traffic for miles behind it. Except the backup here gets measured in billions of dollars a day and weeks of delayed cargo. For a sense of scale, when the container ship Ever Given ran aground sideways across the Suez Canal in March of 2021, blocking a waterway that carries roughly 12% of global trade for 6 days, estimates put the daily cost of that single blockage at somewhere around $9 billion. With more than 400 vessels backed up at either end by the time it was cleared. Malacca carries a larger share of world trade than Suez does, through a channel that's narrower and shallower in its tightest stretch, which means a comparable blockage here, whether from a grounding, a serious collision, or a sustained security crisis, would plausibly cost the world economy more per day than Ever Given did, and take longer to clear given how much less room there is to maneuver salvage vessels around a wreck. That systemic fragility, on top of shallow water, on top of a piracy problem that refuses to stay solved, is why Malacca ranks above Gibraltar. The individual risk to any one ship on any one crossing is often lower than the raw danger of some entries still to come. But the consequence of things going wrong here ripples out further than almost anywhere else covered here, into ports and warehouses and store shelves that have nothing directly to do with this stretch of water at all. At the southern end of the Red Sea, where Africa and the Arabian Peninsula pinch together before opening into the Gulf of Aden, sits Bab el-Mandeb, an Arabic name that translates roughly to the Gate of Tears or the Gate of Grief. There are two competing explanations for where that name actually comes from, and both point to the same underlying idea. Some accounts trace it simply to the dangers ancient sailors faced navigating the strait's currents and reefs long before modern charts existed. An older Arab tradition instead traces it to an earthquake, in some telling separating Africa from Arabia at this exact gap, and drowning everyone caught in the collapse. Whichever version is closer to true, the name has stuck for over 1,000 years, for the same reason it still fits today. This has always been a place people crossing it expected to grieve over. Long before oil tankers, this exact gap carried the frankincense and spice trade linking the Horn of Africa and southern Arabia to the Mediterranean world, and control of it changed hands repeatedly across the centuries, from local Arab powers to Ottoman fleets projecting influence down the Red Sea to Portuguese ships trying, and largely failing, to muscle their way into a trade network that had been running through here since well before Lisbon knew it existed. The cargo has changed. The reason great powers keep showing up to fight over this exact stretch of water hasn't. Even the timing of that ancient trade was dictated by this stretch of ocean rather than by anyone's convenience. Arab and Indian dhow captains sailing this route for over 1,000 years before steam power scheduled entire voyages around the seasonal reversal of the monsoon winds, riding one direction across the Indian Ocean for months at a time, and waiting, sometimes for the better part of a year, for the wind to flip before attempting the journey home. Nothing about a modern container ship's schedule looks like that anymore, but the strait those old captains feared enough to name Gate of Tears is the same strait modern captains are rerouting entire fleets around today. At its narrowest, the strait closes to around 18 miles across, and the small volcanic island of Perim, sitting almost in the middle of the channel, splits the crossing into two passages, with the eastern one running less than 2 miles wide against the Yemeni coast. This strait's modern importance is really a byproduct of a completely different piece of engineering. Before the Suez Canal opened in November of 1869, cutting a direct channel between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, ships moving between Europe and Asia mostly sailed around the entire African continent, and Bab el-Mandeb was just one hazard among many on a much longer route. Suez collapsed that distance by thousands of miles, and in doing so it turned this specific strait, the only way in or out of the Red Sea at the southern end, into a mandatory gateway for a huge share of the traffic the canal was built to attract. Everything moving between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean by way of the Suez Canal has to funnel through this gap first, which is exactly why a strait most people had never heard of 5 years ago suddenly started shaping shipping costs worldwide. If you'd asked a shipping executive to rank this passage 5 years ago, it probably wouldn't have cracked the top half at all. What moved it up traces back to who started using this geography as a weapon, rather than any shift in the water itself. And that's precisely why Bab el-Mandeb earns a genuinely different kind of entry than anything covered so far. Because this danger didn't build slowly through decades of recorded incidents. It arrived within a matter of weeks, in a strait that ships had been sailing through in roughly the same numbers, at roughly the same risk level, for generations beforehand. On the 19th of November, 2023, Houthi forces operating out of Yemen seized the Galaxy Leader, a car carrier transiting the southern Red Sea, holding her crew of 25 for more than a year. That hijacking opened a sustained campaign of missile and drone strikes against commercial shipping through the strait and the wider Red Sea corridor, framed by the Houthis as retaliation tied to the conflict in Gaza. On the 2nd of March 2024, the bulk carrier Rubimar sank, after being struck by an anti-ship ballistic missile 2 weeks earlier, the first vessel the campaign had actually sent to the bottom. 4 days after that, on the 6th of March, an anti-ship ballistic missile hit the bulk carrier True Confidence, killing 3 of her crew, the first fatal attack on a merchant vessel in the campaign, and a grim milestone the shipping industry had been dreading since the strikes began. Major carriers, including Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended transits through the strait entirely rather than risk their vessels and crews, rerouting instead around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adding roughly 10 days and enormous fuel costs to voyages between Asia and Europe. The United States assembled a multinational naval task force to try to protect shipping through the corridor. None of it fully solved the problem. As of this year, attacks and the threat of attacks have continued in waves, occasionally intensifying, occasionally quieting, but never disappearing, with strikes on regional oil infrastructure periodically dropping ship traffic through the strait to some of its lowest levels in months. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's a different category of risk than anything covered so far. Every other entry so far involves danger that comes from the sea itself, or from the volume and pattern of ordinary traffic. Bab el-Mandeb's danger, right now, comes from people deliberately targeting ships with weapons, in a strait that under normal conditions carries something like 12% of global trade passing between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. There's no traffic separation scheme that fixes a missile. There's no navigational skill that avoids a drone. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the strait, which barely registered as a line item before late 2023, climbed fast enough to change the basic economics of the route, and some owners found their usual insurers unwilling to offer coverage at any price for a transit through the affected corridor, forcing them either to self-insure at enormous exposure or simply choose the longer route around Africa instead. That's a form of risk pricing, unlike anything covered so far. Danger measured in whether an underwriter is willing to put a number on the transit at all, rather than in wave height or reef depth. The mitigation options here are almost entirely political and military rather than nautical, which is precisely why this passage ranks above Malacca, despite carrying less absolute traffic today than it did before the crisis started. When a shipping company can reduce its risk mainly by refusing to sail through a strait at all, and a meaningful share of the industry has done exactly that for going on 3 years now, you're looking at a passage where the danger has outrun every tool the maritime world normally has for managing it. It's not a coincidence that the small nation of Djibouti, sitting right at the African side of this strait, now hosts military bases from the United States, France, China, Japan, and Italy simultaneously. An unusual concentration of rival powers' forces in one small territory, justified almost entirely by proximity to this exact gap in the map, with American, French, and Chinese personnel sometimes operating within a few miles of each other, watching the same strait for very different reasons. Camp Lemonnier, the largest permanent American base anywhere on the African continent, sits close enough to the Chinese facility that flight paths and patrol schedules occasionally require deliberate coordination just to avoid friction neither government particularly wants. A strange kind of forced cooperation born entirely out of how few good places there are to watch this exact gate. The Chinese installation there was Beijing's first permanent base anywhere outside its own borders, a marker of how much strategic weight the country now places on a single gap in the map, barely wider than the English Channel. Djibouti's government, for its part, leases land to several of these militaries at once and has built basing rights into a deliberate revenue strategy, treating its position on the strait less as a burden to be defended and more as an asset to be rented out to whoever needs eyes on this water. Whoever can watch and, if needed, respond to trouble in Bab el-Mandeb has bought itself real influence over a meaningful slice of world trade, and enough governments have decided that influence is worth the cost of a permanent base to make Djibouti a small country carrying an unusually heavy concentration of foreign military power for its size. If Bab el-Mandeb shows what happens when conflict actively disrupts a passage, Hormuz shows what a passage looks like permanently sitting under the threat of that same disruption year after year, whether or not it's actively happening on a given day. Between Iran and the Musandam Peninsula, a rugged, mountainous finger of Omani territory separated from the rest of the country by the United Arab Emirates, the Strait of Hormuz is, by nearly every measure, the single most important oil choke point on Earth. Something like 20 million barrels of oil pass through it every day, close to a quarter of all the oil moved by sea globally, alongside about a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas trade. That LNG figure is worth pausing on because it isn't spread evenly across producers the way oil roughly is. Something like 93% of Qatar's entire LNG export economy has to pass through this one strait. And unlike crude oil, which can occasionally be rerouted through pipelines that bypass a choke point, liquefied natural gas has no equivalent overland option at anything like the necessary volume. There's no pipeline anywhere that moves LNG in bulk. It has to go by ship through this specific gap, or it doesn't go anywhere at all. At its narrowest, the shipping channel itself is only about 2 miles wide in each direction, with a shallow strip separating them, meaning inbound and outbound supertankers pass each other within sight, sometimes within a couple of miles, in waters bordered on one side by a country that has repeatedly threatened, in moments of high tension, to close the strait entirely. There's a legal wrinkle underneath all of this worth knowing, because it's part of why the threat carries weight. The strait is narrow enough that its shipping lanes sit entirely within the 12-mile territorial waters, claimed by Oman and Iran, rather than out in open international water the way a wider strait's lanes might. Most nations, and most interpretations of the law of the sea, treat that as a transit passage corridor no coastal state can lawfully block. Iran has never fully accepted that framing, reserving the right, at least on paper, to treat passage through its half of the strait as something closer to conditional permission than an automatic right. That legal gap between how the rest of the world reads the law and how Iran reads it is exactly the kind of ambiguity that turns a threat into something the shipping industry has to take seriously rather than dismiss. Those threats aren't purely theoretical, and the strait has a decades-long track record to prove it. Between 1984 and the end of the Iran-Iraq War in 1988, in a campaign that came to be known as the Tanker War, Iraqi and Iranian forces between them attacked something like 411 ships moving through the Persian Gulf and toward Hormuz, well over half of them oil tankers, killing more than 100 merchant sailors along the way. The lowest point came in July of 1988, when the American warship USS Vincennes, operating in the strait amid the ongoing hostilities, mistakenly identified an Iranian civilian airliner as an attacking military jet and shot it down, killing all 290 people aboard. Even at the height of that 8-year campaign, the strait itself never actually closed. An outside estimate suggests the fighting never disrupted more than a small, single-digit percentage of shipping moving through the Gulf at any given time. That history is worth knowing because it sets the baseline everyone in the industry still measures against. Even a sustained, multi-year shooting war around this strait didn't manage to shut it down, which tells you something about how badly closure would have to be forced before it actually happened, and how much everyone involved already understands about the economic price of trying. On the 13th of June, 2019, explosions ripped through the tankers Kokuka Courageous and Front Altair as they sailed through the Gulf of Oman just after passing through Hormuz, forcing both crews to abandon ship, an incident the United States attributed to Iranian forces, which Iran denied. Barely a month later, on the 19th of July, Iran's Revolutionary Guard seized the British-flagged tanker, Stena Impero, inside the strait itself, holding the vessel and her crew for 2 months as leverage in a separate diplomatic dispute over a detained Iranian tanker. Neither incident closed the strait, Both showed how quickly a routine transit here can turn into a geopolitical incident, with a commercial vessel caught in the middle. And insurance markets responded exactly the way you'd expect, with premiums for tankers transiting the straits sometimes tripling within days of an incident like these, before settling back down once tensions cooled, only to spike again the next time. What technology can and can't do here is genuinely different from every entry before it. Modern tankers handle the 2-mile channel and the shallow separating strip without much trouble under normal conditions, so navigation itself is rarely the hard part. The truly unmanageable piece is the geopolitical layer sitting on top of the water, a layer no amount of radar or satellite tracking touches. A ship's captain can out-navigate a shoal. No captain can out-navigate a naval confrontation between two governments happening around their vessel. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy has built its entire regional strategy around exactly that asymmetry, fielding large numbers of small, fast attack boats based out of hidden coastal and island bunkers along the strait, designed to swarm a much larger vessel from multiple directions at once, rather than confront it in a conventional engagement, a doctrine built specifically to make a slow-moving tanker's size and value a liability rather than a strength inside these particular 2 miles of water. The United States has kept its Fifth Fleet headquartered in Bahrain, just across the Gulf from the strait, continuously since the late 1990s for exactly this reason, a standing naval commitment few other choke points here can claim, alongside naval assets from Britain, France, and regional Gulf states that all treat a persistent presence here as a basic cost of doing business rather than an occasional deployment. Naval forces from multiple countries maintain that more or less permanent presence in and around the strait specifically, because the economic damage from even a brief closure would be immediate and global. Unlike the more localized damage a grounding or a piracy incident tends to cause elsewhere among these passages. The one meaningful workaround anyone has actually built is a pipeline, the roughly 250-mile Habshan to Fujairah line, that lets the United Arab Emirates move up to around 1.8 million barrels a day of crude straight to the Gulf of Oman coastline, skipping the strait entirely, with newer pipeline capacity under construction to push that bypass volume higher still. It's a real mitigation, and a rare one among these 12, physical infrastructure that removes a portion of the danger by removing the need to sail through it at all. It's also nowhere near enough. Even with every planned expansion counted, pipeline bypass capacity covers a small fraction of the roughly 20 million barrels a day that still has no route to market except straight through the strait, which is really the entire story of every mitigation effort covered here condensed into one number. Partial relief is achievable almost everywhere. Complete relief almost nowhere. Just outside the strait's mouth, on the Gulf of Oman side, the port of Fujairah has built an entire business model around that residual risk, growing into the world's second-largest bunkering hub specifically because ships can refuel and transfer cargo there without ever entering the contested waters upstream. On any given day, dozens of tankers sit anchored off Fujairah rather than transiting the strait immediately, effectively using the port as a waiting room where risk can be assessed before committing to the crossing, which tells you plainly how the industry actually behaves when a choke point gets dangerous, building an entire parallel infrastructure of caution around its edges rather than simply refusing to use it. That's why Hormuz sits above Bab el-Mandeb here, even though on most ordinary days it's the quieter of the two. The danger at Hormuz is less about what's happening this particular week and more about what the entire industry knows could happen on short notice, and has been rehearsing contingency plans for since long before this decade started. North of Australia, between the tip of Cape York and the southern coast of Papua New Guinea, the Torres Strait brings us back to a mechanism not yet covered. The ocean floor itself trying to sink your ship regardless of who's driving it or how much traffic is around. This is a passage defined less by open water than by the almost complete absence of it in the places that matter. The strait is scattered with islands, islets, reefs, and shoals, much of it navigable only by vessels with shallow draft, and the primary deep-water route for international shipping, the Prince of Wales Channel, narrows to roughly 800 meters at its tightest point, threading between coral formations that form the northernmost extension of the Great Barrier Reef province, all while strong tidal streams push and pull vessels sideways off their intended line. Roughly 3,000 large commercial vessels make something like 11,000 individual voyages through this stretch of water each year, a volume that sounds modest next to Malacca's tens of thousands of transits, but represents an enormous concentration of risk, given how little usable channel width those ships actually have to share. Pilots working the strait choose between several named channels depending on a vessel's size and draft: the Prince of Wales Channel for the deepest draft ships, the Adolphus Channel, and the Varzin Passage as narrower alternatives further east, each with its own quirks of current and depth that a pilot has to hold in memory rather than relearn from a chart every time. Beyond the shipping question entirely, these reefs support populations of dugong and green turtle found in some of their healthiest numbers anywhere in Australian waters. One more reason a single bad grounding here would cost far more than the ship involved. These reefs were claiming ships long before anyone regulated the passage at all. On the 29th of August, 1791, the Royal Navy frigate HMS Pandora, homeward bound after hunting down mutineers from HMS Bounty across the Pacific, ran onto the outer edge of the Great Barrier Reef and sank the following morning with 14 of the captured mutineers still shackled below decks, killing 35 men in total. The survivors spent 2 nights stranded on a sandbar before setting out in open boats on an 18-day, near 1,400-mile voyage through these same reefs and the Arafura Sea beyond, reaching the nearest European settlement more by desperation than navigation. 2 centuries of steadily improving charts, engines, and now satellite positioning have made that specific kind of disaster far less likely. But the reef the Pandora hit hasn't moved, and it isn't going anywhere. Long before any of this had a shipping lane running through it, the Torres Strait Islander peoples who have lived among these reefs for thousands of years built a navigational tradition around exactly the hazards modern pilots still contend with: reading tidal timing, seasonal wind shifts, and channel depth from generational knowledge passed down through specific communities on islands like Mare, Saibai, and Thursday Island, long before any chart existed. That local knowledge still shapes how the modern pilotage system works, since many of the licensed pilots who guide ships through today trained on and around these same waters, learning currents and channels that don't behave the way a chart alone would suggest. The scale of that ecological stake is formal, not just rhetorical. In July of 2005, the International Maritime Organization approved a joint submission from Australia and Papua New Guinea extending the existing Great Barrier Reef, particularly sensitive sea area designation, to cover Torres Strait as well. An official recognition that this water needed protections beyond what ordinary shipping regulation offers, including routing controls and stricter equipment standards for vessels like oil tankers passing through. It's one of a small number of places on Earth to carry that designation, and Torres Strait earned it specifically because of what a single serious grounding here could do to a reef system that took thousands of years to build and would take generations to recover, if it recovered at all. The wider region carries its own military memory too. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought in May of 1942, not far to the southeast, was the engagement that first stopped Japan's naval advance toward Australia, and it was fought specifically to protect exactly this kind of maritime access. The sea lanes running past Cape York, and through these waters that any push toward northern Australia would have had to use. Australia's response to the physical hazard is one of the strictest regulatory regimes on this entire list, and it's worth understanding as a case study in what happens when a government decides that navigational skill alone isn't sufficient protection for a reef system this sensitive and this unforgiving. Since October of 2006, compulsory pilotage has applied to Torres Strait, Any vessel 70 meters or longer, along with every loaded oil tanker, chemical tanker, or liquefied gas carrier, is legally required to carry a locally licensed pilot for the transit, someone who has spent years learning this specific stretch of reef, these specific tidal patterns, these specific channels, rather than relying on charts alone. It's an unusual arrangement in international waters, since the strait technically falls under the doctrine of transit passage that normally lets any vessel move through international straits without a coastal state's permission, and Australia has had to defend the pilotage requirement diplomatically more than once as a result, arguing that the ecological stakes justify the exception. In practice, that means a licensed pilot boards from a dedicated pilot vessel or by helicopter well before a ship reaches the reef, stays aboard through the entire transit, and only disembarks once the vessel has cleared the hazardous stretch, adding real cost and scheduling complexity to every large transit, but removing the single biggest variable, an unfamiliar bridge crew guessing at a channel they have never actually seen. The reef itself has no interest in that legal argument. A supertanker grounding on coral here wouldn't just risk the ship and crew, it would risk a reef system significant enough to have already earned special international protection, sitting a few dozen meters below a shipping lane carrying some of the largest vessels afloat. That's the through line for Torres Strait, and it's genuinely distinct from the previous 6 entries. The core hazard here is a fixed, unforgiving physical one, largely independent of how many ships are moving through or whether people and governments are deliberately creating the danger. A reef system that doesn't move, threaded by a channel barely wider than a large ship's own length, with tidal currents strong enough to push a vessel off that line within seconds, and a mitigation strategy that, unusually among these 12, relies almost entirely on human expertise rather than technology. A striking contrast with a strait carrying some of the most technologically advanced vessels on the water anywhere covered here. Radar shows you where the reef is. It doesn't show you how the tide will be running in the next 10 minutes, or which of a dozen similar-looking channels actually holds the depth you need. That's still a job for a person who's done this crossing hundreds of times, which tells you something about the limits of instrumentation even in the 21st century. We're at the halfway point now, and it's worth noticing what's changed underneath the ranking as we've climbed through it. Every entry so far, Dover's traffic, Gibraltar's currents, Malacca's economics and piracy, Bab el-Mandeb and Hormuz's politics, even Torres Strait's reef, has involved a danger that people created, worsened, or at minimum chose to keep sailing directly into for reasons of trade and convenience. Every one of those dangers, in some meaningful way, is a human arrangement layered on top of geography, which means every one of them is at least theoretically negotiable through better rules, better technology, or a different political decision somewhere upstream. That negotiability is exactly why they rank where they rank. From here on, that starts to change. The remaining 6 entries lean harder and harder on forces that were never going to ask anyone's permission, and the ranking from this point forward is really tracking how much of that negotiability has been lost. Between Java and Sumatra sits a strait roughly 15 to 20 miles wide for most of its length, narrow enough that ships have used it for centuries as a shorter alternate route into the Indian Ocean when traffic or piracy made the Malacca Strait less appealing. That history turns the conversation in a direction none of the previous entries have gone, because sitting almost directly in the shipping lane is a volcano. On the morning of August 27th, 1883, the island volcano of Krakatoa, positioned in the strait itself, erupted with a force that ranks among the most violent in recorded history. The sound was heard in Perth, Australia, nearly 2,000 miles away, at the time recorded as the loudest sound ever documented by human instruments. Captain Sampson of the British ship Norham Castle, riding out the eruption some 40 miles from the volcano, wrote in his log that the noise had been so violent it burst the eardrums of more than half his crew, adding that he was writing the entry blind, in complete darkness, ash having blotted out the sun in the middle of the day. On Java's western coast, the lighthouse keeper at the port town of Anjer sent a final telegram shortly before 10 that night, describing continuing explosions. And then the line went dead. Nearly all 3,000 people living in Anjer died within hours. The keeper's own wife survived only because she had already fled inland at dawn, after watching the volcano glow and listening to explosions that hadn't stopped since the previous day. Water did the actual killing. The collapse of the volcano generated tsunami waves that reached heights of around 120 feet in places, traveling across the strait at roughly 60 miles an hour. And by the time they finished, they had destroyed some 295 towns and villages along the coasts of Java and Sumatra. The official Dutch colonial death toll stood at 36,417, though modern researchers regard that figure as conservative, and the waves that followed the eruption accounted for roughly 90% of those deaths. The eruption's reach went far beyond the strait itself. Ash and sulfuric particles blasted into the stratosphere circled the entire planet on high-altitude winds, producing unusually vivid red sunsets reported as far away as Norway and New York for close to 3 years afterward, and cooling global temperatures measurably in the seasons that followed. Some art historians have even suggested that the blood-red sky in Edvard Munch's famous painting The Scream, painted a decade later, echoes a Krakatoa sunset the artist may have witnessed as a young man in Norway, though Munch scholars are divided on how literally to take that connection. Whatever the truth of the painting, the eruption's atmospheric effects are not in dispute, and they're a useful reminder that this particular strait's worst event didn't stay contained to the water it happened in. None of that history has slowed down how this strait gets used today, and most of that use has nothing to do with international shipping at all. The ferry crossing between Merak on Java and Bakauheni on Sumatra runs around the clock, with a departure roughly every 12 minutes carrying trucks, buses, and passengers between two islands home to a combined population well over 200 million people, a frequency matched by few ferry routes anywhere in the world. During the annual holiday travel surge around Eid, millions of people cross this exact stretch of water in the span of a couple of weeks, on an aging ferry fleet, over the same strait that killed tens of thousands of people twice within recorded memory. Sunda Strait's layered reality is exactly that, a geological hazard capable of almost no warning, sitting directly underneath a ferry corridor busier than almost any other on Earth. Krakatoa didn't disappear after 1883. A new volcanic cone, Anak Krakatau, meaning child of Krakatoa, grew up out of the same caldera over the following decades and has remained active ever since, periodically erupting in ways that keep this strait under a kind of volcanic surveillance no other passage here requires. That surveillance failed to prevent a repeat disaster in December of 2018, when a flank of Anak Krakatau collapsed into the sea during an ongoing eruption, without the large preceding earthquake that normally triggers tsunami warning systems in the region. The resulting wave struck the coastlines on both sides of the strait with almost no warning at all, killing more than 400 people and injuring many thousands more. It was, by most measures, the deadliest volcanically triggered tsunami since Krakatoa's own eruption more than a century earlier, and it happened specifically because the warning systems built around this strait were largely designed to catch tsunamis triggered by earthquakes, leaving them blind to the sudden underwater landslides a collapsing volcanic flank can produce with essentially no lead time. Indonesian authorities have since worked with international researchers to build a genuinely different kind of system in response, one using real-time sea level sensors and acoustic equipment on the seabed itself to catch the physical signature of a landslide directly, rather than waiting on the seismic trigger an earthquake-based network is built to detect. It's a direct, if painfully late, causal fix. A specific failure in 2018 produced a specific technical answer aimed at that exact gap, though nobody involved in building it claims it would catch every version of this hazard the volcano might still produce, and the ferries still cross regardless, because the alternative to crossing is no longer really an option for two islands, this economically bound together. Here's why Sunda ranks above Torres Strait rather than below it. Even though both involve fixed geological hazards, Torres Strait's reef is dangerous, but it's static, mapped, and predictable within the limits of tide and weather. A pilot who knows the channel can navigate it safely almost every time. Sunda Strait's hazard is an active volcano capable, on a timescale nobody can precisely predict, of collapsing part of itself into the water and generating a wave that reaches the coast before any conventional warning system has time to sound. That's a fundamentally different category of risk, one that skill and local knowledge can't fully manage, since the real threat lives in the geology underneath the destination, rather than anything happening during the transit itself. Ships transiting the strait on an ordinary day face nothing more than any other tropical strait would offer. But this is a passage where an ordinary day can end with essentially no notice, and has twice within recorded memory. Off the Atlantic coasts of France and Spain, the Bay of Biscay doesn't have a choke point in the geographic sense at all. No narrow gap between two landmasses, no reef, no strait in the technical meaning of the word. It's a wide, roughly triangular indentation carved into the western coastline of Europe, open to the full fetch of the North Atlantic on its western side, and ringed by a continental shelf that drops away sharply toward genuinely deep water not far offshore, a combination that gives storm systems room to build real size before they ever reach a coast that could blunt them. Local fishing fleets, still a major presence in these waters out of French and Spanish ports alike, work some of the most dangerous conditions of any commercial fishery in Europe for exactly that reason. Since smaller vessels have far less margin against the same swells, a container ship simply rides over. The bay's reputation is embedded in British culture in an unexpectedly literal way, too. Biscay is one of the named sea areas read out on the BBC's shipping forecast, a broadcast tradition running more than a century and a half on national radio, and anyone who has half listened to it late at night knows the area names by rhythm before they know what any of them mean. Biscay tends to show up with gale warnings, often enough that regular listeners learn to associate the name with rough water long before they ever learn why. It's included here because size and openness can be their own kind of danger, and because among working sailors this stretch of water has a reputation that rivals or exceeds almost anywhere else covered here, for a reason that has nothing to do with narrowness and everything to do with what happens when Atlantic weather systems meet a specific shape of continental shelf. The mechanism is worth explaining plainly, because it's different from anything before it. Atlantic depressions track eastward toward Europe and often intensify as they cross the bay, partly because the relatively shallow continental shelf underneath causes swells to steepen rapidly as they approach shore, and partly because storms entering from the west can collide with fronts moving down from the north, producing what sailors who've crossed it describe as confused water, waves arriving from multiple directions at once rather than in a single organized swell. That confusion is exactly the condition that produces rogue waves, single waves far larger than the surrounding sea state, once mise-en-scènes, formed when multiple wave trains happen to align and reinforce each other for a few catastrophic seconds. In 2002, the French sailor Alain Gautier was aboard his 60-foot trimaran Foncia in the bay when a wave he described as pyramid-shaped rose out of a 30-foot swell and snapped one of his main structural beams as though the boat were a toy. In February of 2014, the tanker Pink Coral encountered a rogue wave in the same waters strong enough to cause significant structural damage despite being a purpose-built commercial vessel, not a racing yacht. Maritime insurers and researchers who track large vessel losses cite figures suggesting roughly 200 supertankers and container ships over 200 meters long have been lost worldwide to severe weather conditions over the past 2 decades, with rogue waves suspected as a contributing factor in a meaningful share of those losses. And the Bay of Biscay sits high on the list of places those encounters concentrate. The bay's reputation isn't new, and it goes back centuries further than any tanker or trimaran. Basque communities along this coast were hunting North Atlantic right whales out of the Bay of Biscay as early as the 11th century, a trade organized around coastal lookout towers where spotters watched for the whales' seasonal migration and signaled fleets of small open boats to launch after them by hand using harpoons into exactly the kind of steep, unpredictable swell described above. It was dangerous enough, and the local whale population thin enough after a few centuries of hunting, that Basque crews eventually pushed their boats across the Atlantic entirely, chasing whales as far as Newfoundland and Labrador by the 1500s rather than keep working these waters alone. That's worth knowing because it undercuts any idea that Biscay's danger is a modern invention of bigger ships and busier shipping lanes. People who worked this water for a living, in open rowing boats with nothing like modern forecasting, organized their entire economy around respecting exactly the conditions that still sink vessels here today. The bay's reputation isn't limited to rogue waves and old whaling risk either. During the Second World War, Royal Air Force Coastal Command ran a sustained campaign specifically against German U-boats transiting the bay on their way between French Atlantic bases and the open ocean, because the bay itself was already such a well-known bottleneck for submarine traffic that patrolling it made strategic sense in a way patrolling open ocean elsewhere didn't. More recently, in November of 2002, the aging single-hulled tanker Prestige, carrying heavy fuel oil off the coast of Galicia at the bay's southern edge, ran into exactly the kind of severe weather this stretch of water is known for, began taking on water, and ultimately broke in two undertow before sinking, spilling oil that fouled more than 800 kilometers of coastline across Spain and France, in what became one of Europe's worst environmental disasters. Weather didn't cause that spill on its own. An aging hull and a difficult decision about where to tow a damaged tanker played their part too. But the storm conditions in the bay are exactly what turned a serious mechanical problem into a catastrophic one. What separates Biscay from the strait-based entries covered earlier is that there's genuinely very little geography-based mitigation available here. You can build a traffic separation scheme for a narrow channel. You can require a local pilot for a reef system. You cannot regulate the shape of a rogue wave or reliably forecast exactly when steepening swells over the continental shelf will align into something structurally dangerous, even with modern weather routing software that's dramatically better than what existed even 20 years ago. Ships still cross the bay constantly, and the vast majority cross without incident, aided enormously by better forecasting than sailors had a generation ago. But the character of the risk here, open water, no landmass to hide behind, storm systems that intensify specifically as they arrive, and a wave phenomenon science still can't perfectly predict, puts Biscay ahead of every narrow strait passage covered so far. Narrow water can be managed by controlling where ships go. Open water in a storm can only be managed by controlling when ships go, and weather forecasts, however good they've become, are still forecasts. Between New Zealand's North and South Islands, Cook Strait earns its place through a mechanism distinct from anything covered so far, the sheer unpredictability of local weather. Driven by a funnel effect between two mountainous land masses, in a place where conditions can shift from manageable to lethal within the space of a single ferry crossing. The strait itself is geologically young, carved out only around 7,000 years ago as rising sea levels after the last ice age finally breached a low-lying plain that had connected the two islands, drowning river valleys on its southern side into the tangle of channels now called the Marlborough Sounds. Average depth across the strait runs around 125 meters, but a deep basin to the northwest drops to nearly 400 meters, an uneven seafloor that helps explain why the water above it behaves so unpredictably. Tidal currents through the strait itself can run past 4 knots, reversing direction roughly every 6 hours as water forced between the islands rushes to equalize, and that current interacts with local wind patterns in ways forecasters still describe as genuinely difficult to model at short notice. The mountains on either side, the Tararua Range above Wellington, and the Kaikoura Ranges across the water in the South Island act almost like the walls of a funnel. So wind that might be a moderate breeze some distance out at sea can accelerate to gale force by the time it squeezes through the gap between them, the same physical principle that speeds air through a narrow doorway. Maori navigators knew this water as Te Moana o Raukawa, the Sea of Raukawa, and crossed it by waka for centuries before any European chart existed, building up exactly the kind of detailed, orally transmitted knowledge of wind, current, and seasonal timing that this strait has always demanded of anyone who wants to cross it safely. Knowledge that modern forecasting has supplemented rather than fully replaced. The clearest illustration of that is worth telling as its own story, rather than folding into general statistics, because it shows exactly how fast this strait can turn on the people crossing it. On the night of April 9th, into the morning of April 10th, 1968, the inter-island ferry Wahine left Lyttelton bound for Wellington with 734 passengers and crew aboard. As the ship approached Wellington Harbor the following morning, it sailed directly into the collision of two separate weather systems. Tropical cyclone Giselle, tracking south down the country, meeting a cold, southerly front head-on. The combination produced extraordinarily violent, chaotic wind and sea conditions inside the strait, exactly the kind of confused, rapidly escalating weather this passage is known for. The Wahine's steering failed as it tried to enter the harbor. Blown off course, the ferry struck Barrett Reef, tearing away a propeller. The crew fought to keep the ship under control for hours as conditions worsened, before it eventually rolled onto its side within sight of Wellington itself, close enough that people on shore watched it happen in real time. 51 people died that day. A 52nd victim died several weeks later from injuries sustained in the sinking, and a 53rd death, attributed to the disaster, occurred more than 2 decades afterward. It remains New Zealand's worst modern maritime disaster, and what stays with people is that a scheduled ferry route people crossed routinely went down within sight of a capital city. The Inter-Island ferry service itself has had a rough recent stretch even without another Wahine-scale disaster, with the national operator cycling through aging vessels, canceled sailings during heavy weather windows, and a long-running political fight over funding replacement ships, a reminder that the strait doesn't have to produce a catastrophe to keep shaping how New Zealand actually gets people and freight between its two main islands. That's what makes Cook Strait a different kind of danger than the storm systems out in the Bay of Biscay. Biscay's weather, however severe, tends to build with some warning, tracked by satellite days out. Cook Strait's danger comes from a local funnel effect. The strait acts almost like a wind tunnel between two mountain ranges that can turn a forecast manageable crossing into a genuinely dangerous one over the course of a few hours, sometimes less, as systems collide in ways general regional forecasts don't always fully capture at the local scale. Modern ferries operating the strait today carry far better stability systems, weather routing, and structural design than the Wahine did in 1968, and serious incidents have become rare as a result, though rare is doing real work in that sentence rather than standing in for impossible. But operators still cancel or delay sailings regularly, sometimes with very short notice because the specific combination of wind funneling, sea state, and rapid weather shifts inside this strait remains something forecasting can flag as likely, without ever fully guaranteeing safe passage on a given afternoon. That gap between likely fine and guaranteed fine is exactly why this entry ranks above the open, if brutal, predictability of Biscay's big Atlantic storms. The ferries themselves have carried names locals recognize instantly, the way Londoners know their tube lines. Vessels like Aratere and Kaitaki cycling through the crossing year after year. And regular travelers develop their own instinct for which sailings to avoid based on nothing more scientific than the look of the sky over the Kaikoura Ranges that morning, a folk knowledge running in parallel with the official forecasts and not always agreeing with them. At the southern tip of South America, threading between the mainland and the islands of Tierra del Fuego, The Strait of Magellan takes us into a passage where history and hazard are almost impossible to separate, because the man it's named for nearly didn't survive discovering it. And the reasons he nearly didn't survive are largely still true 500 years later. On October 21st, 1520, Ferdinand Magellan's fleet entered the channel that would eventually bear his name, beginning a crossing that took 38 days to cover roughly 350 miles of water, an agonizingly slow pace that tells you almost everything about the conditions involved. Relentless westerly gales pinned ships in place or drove them backward. Currents ran in directions that didn't match the charts because there were no charts, only dead reckoning and increasingly desperate improvisation. One of Magellan's ships, the Santiago, sent ahead to scout the route. Wrecked in a storm on October 22nd, just one day into the crossing, though remarkably all 52 of its crew survived and were rescued by the fleet's boats. Another ship, the San Antonio, deserted partway through and sailed back to Spain rather than continue, leaving Magellan with 3 vessels instead of 4. Given what the crossing had already cost them, that desertion reads less like cowardice and more like a rational response to a passage that, even to 16th century sailors who had crossed unmapped oceans to get there, felt uniquely hostile. Magellan's Strait wasn't the only attempt at finding a way around the bottom of South America, and the next passage owes its existence to a captain who tried this exact route and got beaten by it. Nearly 6 decades later, in 1578, the English privateer Francis Drake led his own small fleet into the strait, made it through to the Pacific side, and then ran straight into a storm so violent it drove his flagship, the Golden Hind, far south of the strait's mouth, well past 57 degrees south latitude. When the weather finally cleared, Drake found himself in open water with no land in sight to the south, proof that Tierra del Fuego wasn't attached to some vast, undiscovered southern continent the way most European mapmakers still assumed. He never deliberately sailed the passage that would later carry his name. A storm did it for him, and that's the passage waiting at the very top. There's a third route around the bottom of South America too, discovered properly a few centuries later. The Beagle Channel, a narrower, more sheltered passage running south of Tierra del Fuego, surveyed in detail during the 1820s and 30s by the Royal Navy ship that gave it its name, with a young naturalist called Charles Darwin aboard for its second voyage, taking notes on glaciers he described as more beautiful than anything he'd imagined. The Beagle Channel is calmer than Magellan's Strait in places and shorter than swinging out into Drake Passage, but it's too narrow and too shallow in stretches for the large commercial vessels that matter most here, which leaves modern shipping choosing between the 2 options that actually matter: Magellan's engineered, centuries-tested compromise, or the open water still to come. The strait itself isn't one uniform stretch of water, and that variation is part of what made it so hard to chart in the first place. The eastern section, opening from the Atlantic, is relatively wide and straightforward, which is exactly why early navigators kept assuming it might just be another bay rather than an actual passage through to the other ocean. Further west, it tightens into what's still called the English Narrows, a genuinely tight, twisting channel bounded by steep terrain on both sides where a ship has essentially no room to correct a mistake, before finally opening back out into a broader, fjord-like approach to the Pacific. The Chilean city of Punta Arenas, sitting roughly midway along the strait, grew up specifically to serve ships making this crossing, supplying coal and provisions through the age of steam and remaining, to this day, the main port anyone transiting the strait can count on for real support if something goes wrong. For thousands of years before any European charted a single mile of it, the Yagan people lived along these channels, and the Beagle Channel further south almost entirely by canoe, hunting sea lions and diving for shellfish in water cold enough that early European visitors couldn't understand how anyone survived it without heavy clothing, while the Selknam lived inland across Tierra del Fuego itself as hunters of guanaco rather than sailors. Both peoples read this exact water and coastline with a depth of knowledge no passing fleet, however well provisioned, could match in a single crossing. Knowledge that colonization in the centuries after Magellan did enormous damage to before much of it could ever be written down. The wildlife along the way tells its own story about how isolated this passage still is today. Colonies of Magellanic penguins, sea lions, and, in the strait's more sheltered channels, pods of orca and dolphin share these waters largely undisturbed, a sign of just how little human traffic still moves through here compared to the volume passing through Panama's canal 1,000 miles to the north, even now, 5 centuries after Magellan proved the route existed. The single biggest change in this strait's importance had nothing to do with the water itself. When the Panama Canal opened on the 15th of August, 1914, a transit that had taken this strait's ships something like 20 to 30 hours through hostile currents and unpredictable wind suddenly had an alternative that took as little as 8 to 10 hours through a controlled, artificial waterway with no weather worth mentioning. Traffic through Magellan Strait collapsed almost overnight, and Punta Arenas, which had built its entire economy around coaling ships making the crossing, had to reinvent itself as steam gave way to diesel, and the coaling trade dried up along with it. What's changed since 1520 and what hasn't is the real story of Magellan Strait today. Modern vessels have engines, so they're no longer entirely at the mercy of wind direction the way Magellan's fleet was. And modern charts mean nobody's navigating blind. That's real, meaningful mitigation, and it's why serious incidents in the Strait today are far rarer than they were in the age of sail. But the underlying conditions Magellan fought are still there. A channel that narrows to just over a mile across in places while widening to nearly 20 miles in others. A sub-Antarctic climate that produces sudden gales, dense fog, and in some stretches drifting ice with little warning, and strong tidal currents that can run against a vessel regardless of engine power. Large ships still choose this route over the Panama Canal in certain circumstances, particularly vessels too big for the canal's locks even after their expansion, which means some of the largest ships afloat are still, in this decade, threading the same gales and currents that nearly ended a voyage 5 centuries ago. That combination, real technological mitigation layered on top of genuinely unchanged natural hazard, is what pushes Magellan above Cook Strait. Cook Strait's danger is mostly local and short-lived, a bad few hours during a crossing, survivable by simply waiting it out at anchor. Magellan's danger persists across days of transit through consistently hostile conditions, with far fewer nearby ports to shelter in if things turn, which is a difference of duration and options as much as raw intensity. 2 entries left, and both of them break a pattern that's held for everything ranked so far. Every passage up to this point, no matter how severe, is a known quantity. Its danger has been measured across decades or centuries of ships actually sailing through it, which means insurers, regulators, and captains all have a real historical baseline to plan against. The final 2 entries don't offer that same comfort in the same way. One is a passage whose danger is actively changing under the traffic trying to use it. The other is a passage whose danger has never changed at all, and never will, regardless of who tries to plan around it. Between the easternmost edge of Russia and the westernmost edge of Alaska, the Bering Strait narrows to about 53 miles across at its tightest point. Close enough that on the clearest of days you can, in theory, see across it. Genuinely clear days at that distance are rarer than the postcard version of the fact suggests, since fog and low clouds sit over this water more often than not, even in the brief summer window. But the line-of-sight geometry itself is real, and on the handful of days a year when the air actually clears, you're looking at another continent with your bare eyes. In the middle of that gap sit the 2 Diomede Islands, Russian Big Diomede and American Little Diomede, separated from each other by just 2.5 miles of water, with the international boundary and the international date line running directly between them. Stand on Little Diomede and look across at Big Diomede, and you're looking almost a full day into the future. It's one of the strangest geographic facts on Earth, and it sits right in the middle of a passage named for Vitus Bering, the Danish-born explorer who charted these waters for the Russian Navy in the 1730s and 40s and never made it home, dying of scurvy on the desolate island that now bears his name after his own ship wrecked on the return voyage. Bering wasn't actually first. The Cossack explorer Semyon Desnev had sailed through the strait as early as 1648, roughly 80 years before Bering's own voyage, though word of that expedition took so long to reach the rest of Russia that it barely registered in the wider historical record. And long before either of them, Yupik, Inupiat, and Chukchi communities on both the Siberian and Alaskan sides had been crossing this water routinely by skinboat, trading, hunting, and intermarrying across a strait that, to the people who actually lived on it, was never really a barrier at all. The idea of simply removing the strait as an obstacle entirely is older than most people realize. American railroad investors proposed a tunnel beneath the strait as early as 1904, connecting a rail line through Siberia to one through Alaska, and Tsar Nicholas II's government actually approved the concept the following year before war and revolution buried it. Versions of the same idea, a tunnel or a bridge finally closing that 53-mile gap, have resurfaced roughly every generation since, championed at different points by American senators, Chinese state media, and Russian officials alike, and none of them have ever moved past the proposal stage, which tells you something about how seriously the underlying difficulty of this water has always been taken even by people trying to eliminate it. 3 centuries after Bering's own voyage, the strait he mapped is entering a genuinely new phase, becoming far more heavily used than it's ever been at exactly the moment it becomes more dangerous, not less. For most of the 20th century, this strait carried a different kind of danger entirely, one measured in politics rather than physics. During the Cold War, the narrow gap between Big Diomede and Little Diomede became known as the Ice Curtain, a nod to the Iron Curtain dividing Europe, after Soviet and American authorities sealed the border between the islands in 1948. Indigenous Inupiat families who had crossed freely between the islands for thousands of years, visiting relatives and following traditional hunting and trading routes that paid no attention to a line drawn on a map, found themselves separated overnight, unable to cross a gap you could paddle in minutes. That wasn't the only wartime traffic this strait carried, and the earlier chapter cuts against the later one in an almost ironic way. Between 1942 and 1945, American pilots flew something like 8,000 combat and transport aircraft from Montana up through Alaska to Fairbanks, where Soviet air crews took over and flew them onward across the Bering Strait into Siberia as Lend-Lease aid for the fight against Germany, a wartime alliance route crossing this exact gap years before the same border froze into the Ice Curtain. That border stayed effectively frozen shut for decades, more a matter of geopolitics than geography, until the swimmer Lynn Cox crossed the 2.5 miles between the islands in 1987, an act celebrated on both sides as a genuine thaw, and followed a few years later by a formal agreement between the two governments to cooperate on conservation and cultural exchange across the strait. The physical danger never went away during any of that. What changed was who was allowed to face it. Here's the mechanism behind the strait's future, and it's the first genuinely future-facing entry covered so far, rather than a present or historical one. For most of modern shipping history, the Bering Strait and the wider Arctic Sea routes it connects to weren't heavily trafficked, because sea ice made them unreliable or outright impassable for large parts of the year. That's changing. Arctic sea ice has been retreating for decades, and shipping companies, along with several governments, have been increasingly interested in Arctic routes as a shorter path between Asia and Europe or North America's east coast, cutting thousands of miles off traditional routes through Suez or the Panama Canal. More open water sounds, on its face, like less danger. In practice, it works the other way. The water opening up is thinner, less consistent ice that's harder to forecast than either solid pack ice or a fully ice-free strait would be, moving in patterns shipping companies and even experienced Arctic pilots are still learning. A spill in these conditions would behave nothing like one in warmer water. Cold slows the microbial breakdown that helps disperse oil in temperate seas to a crawl. Ice can trap spilled fuel beneath the surface for months where skimmers cannot reach it. And the same walrus and whale migrations indigenous communities on both shores still depend on for subsistence hunting would carry any contamination straight through the food chain that feeds them. Add extreme cold, genuine remoteness from any major search and rescue infrastructure, fog that forms fast in the cold air meeting relatively warmer water, and strong currents funneling between the narrow gap the strait forms between two oceans. And you get a passage where increasing traffic is running directly into decreasing predictability, rather than the two trends canceling each other out the way you might expect. That combination, growing use meeting, growing unpredictability, is precisely why the Bering Strait ranks second rather than somewhere in the middle of the order here. Every entry before it involves a danger that's either well understood and being actively managed, like Dover's traffic or Torres Strait's reef, or a danger that's severe but geographically contained, like a single volcano or a single stretch of storm-prone water. The Bering Strait works differently. The very thing making it more accessible, retreating ice, is also making conditions inside it less predictable year to year. And a serious incident here would occur far from any serious rescue infrastructure, with the nearest help potentially hours or days away rather than the minutes it takes at Dover. The nearest major air stations capable of launching a serious search and rescue response sit hundreds of miles south on the Alaskan mainland, and weather that grounds aircraft on the American side just as easily grounds them on the Russian side, which means a vessel in trouble in the strait itself, particularly outside the short summer window, may simply have to survive on its own resources for far longer than anyone on Dover's tightly monitored 21 miles would ever have to contemplate. Nobody fully knows yet what a mature, high-traffic Bering Strait shipping lane looks like in 20 years, because it's never existed before. That genuine uncertainty about a route seeing rapidly rising interest is its own category of risk, distinct from every mechanism covered so far. Russia has invested heavily in a fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers specifically to escort commercial traffic along its Arctic coastline toward this strait, betting that northern sea route traffic will keep climbing as ice retreats further. Cargo volume along that route reached somewhere around 38 million tons in 2024, a record. And official projections call for something like 90 million tons by 2030 and well over 100 million tons within the following 5 years. Growth curves that assume the ice will keep cooperating at a pace nobody can actually guarantee. And that brings us to the passage every other entry so far has been building toward, the place where all the mitigation strategies that worked elsewhere simply run out of things to attach to. We already met its namesake back at Entry 3, blown south of the Strait of Magellan by a storm in 1578 and left staring at open water where a continent was supposed to be, between the southern tip of South America and the South Shetland Islands off Antarctica. The Drake Passage is roughly 500 nautical miles of that same open water, and open is the operative word, because it's the only place on Earth where the ocean can circle the entire planet without hitting a single landmass to slow it down. That's the mechanism, and it's worth sitting with because it's genuinely unlike anything covered so far. Every previous entry involved a hazard shaped by proximity to land, a narrow channel, a reef, a volcano, a strait between two mountainous coastlines. Drake Passage is dangerous specifically because of the absence of land. Somewhere within the passage, shifting slightly with the seasons, sits the Antarctic Convergence, the line where cold, dense water flowing north from Antarctica sinks abruptly beneath warmer sub-Antarctic water, a boundary so sharp that ships crossing it can measure a genuine drop in sea surface temperature within the space of a few miles. That collision of water masses, on top of the wind and the current, adds yet another layer of energy to a sea state that barely needed the help. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the largest ocean current system on the planet, moves somewhere around 130 to 150 million cubic meters of water per second around Antarctica, roughly 600 times the flow of the Amazon River, and it does so continuously, because nothing on Earth stands in its way. It's the only current on the planet that touches all three of the other major oceans directly, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian, exchanging water and heat between all of them as it circles, which makes this narrow gap between two continents, oddly enough, one of the most important connective threads in the entire global ocean system, rather than just a dangerous shortcut between two seas. The Antarctic convergence is enormous biologically as well as physically. The mixing of cold and warm water drags nutrients up from the deep and fuels the krill swarms that anchor the entire southern ocean food web, from penguins and seals up through the whales that migrate here to feed. That biological stake is exactly why vessels crossing the convergence operate under strict Antarctic Treaty protocols governing ballast water, waste discharge, and wildlife disturbance. Rules layered on top of the ordinary navigational challenge of the crossing itself. Wind behaves the same way. The bands of westerly wind at these latitudes have earned names sailors have used for centuries. The Roaring Forties, the Furious 50s, and in the Drake Passage itself, the Screaming 60s, each name a step up in violence, because each band of latitude sits further from any landmass capable of breaking the wind's momentum. There's nothing to slow it down, so it doesn't. The result is a sea state unlike anywhere else covered here. Typical wave heights in the passage run somewhere around 13 to 23 feet even in ordinary conditions, which would already count as rough water almost anywhere else on Earth. During storms, waves regularly reach 42 to 49 feet, and some ship captains have reported encounters with waves closer to 66 feet, more than 6 stories of solid water. Modern expedition crews and sailors who make this crossing regularly enough to have their own vocabulary for it talk about the difference between the Drake Lake, a rare, calm crossing that feels almost like a reward, and the Drake Shake, the version everyone actually plans for because the wind and the current don't take requests. A typical crossing between the port of Ushuaia, at the southern tip of Argentina, and the Antarctic Peninsula takes roughly 48 hours each way aboard a modern expedition vessel, and icebergs become a genuine factor as ships approach the Antarctic side, tracked by radar and satellite imagery well before they're visible from the bridge. Well before there is a track banning, one more hazard layered onto wind and current that modern instruments can at least see coming even if nothing can make it go away. What that tracking can't always fix is judgment under pressure once the passage is behind you. In November of 2007, the expedition ship Explorer, having already crossed Drake Passage and entered the ice-choked Bransfield Strait near the South Shetland Islands, struck what her captain later admitted he had mistaken for thinner, more manageable first-year ice. It was multi-year ice, dense and unyielding, and the hull couldn't take it. All 154 people aboard were rescued safely, but the ship went down in roughly 600 meters of water, becoming the first passenger vessel ever lost in Antarctic waters, and a case study, ever since, in how the danger of this region doesn't end the moment Drake Passage itself is behind you. Modern vessels crossing the passage, including scientific research ships and the cruise vessels that now regularly carry tourists toward Antarctica, use satellite weather routing, stabilization systems, and reinforced hulls that would have been unimaginable to the sailors who first charted this water centuries ago in ships built from wood and canvas. And it helps. Crossings today are safer, in a statistical sense, than they've ever been. But none of that technology changes the underlying physics. It doesn't calm the current. It doesn't block the wind. It just gives a modern ship a slightly better chance of surviving conditions that remain, at their core, exactly as severe as they were when Francis Drake's fleet was blown into this water without ever intending to go there. More people are choosing to face all of that on purpose every year than at any point in history, Roughly 8,000 tourists crossed toward Antarctica in the mid-1990s. Recent seasons have topped 100,000. Industry projections suggest that figure could roughly quadruple again within a few years, and the overwhelming majority of those travelers get there the same way every previous generation did, across this exact 500 miles of water, on a ship no more able to negotiate with the wind than Magellan's fleet was, just far better equipped to survive not getting its way. This is why Drake Passage sits at the very top of the list, above even the Bering Strait's growing uncertainty or Magellan's centuries-old hazards. Every other entry, however dangerous, involves risk that skilled navigation, regulation, technology, or simply avoiding the wrong season can meaningfully reduce. A pilot can read a reef. A traffic scheme can separate lanes. A captain can choose not to sail into a known storm system or reroute around a conflict zone entirely. Drake Passage offers none of those escape valves in the same way, because there's no season without wind here, no route around the current, no local knowledge that neutralizes physics operating at a scale of hundreds of millions of cubic meters of water per second. The Furious 50s don't check the calendar, and that's close to a literal description of a wind system that answers to latitude and nothing else. Every ship that crosses is making a calculated bet against forces modern engineering can withstand but never actually tame, which is the one honest distinction between this passage and everything ranked below it. Ask an expedition crew who's made the crossing dozens of times what they actually watch for, and the answer isn't the wind speed forecast, so much as how the barometric pressure is trending over the preceding day, since a fast-falling reading tells an experienced officer more about what the Furious 50s are about to do than almost any single number a satellite model can hand them. A small reminder that even here, at the very top, where nature holds every card that matters, human judgment still has a job to do, just a narrower one than anywhere else, choosing, as precisely as possible, which version of dangerous a ship is about to sail into, rather than deciding whether it will be dangerous at all. 12 passages, 12 different reasons ships still approach parts of this ocean with real caution. And what's interesting, looking back across the whole list, is how few of them share a single cause. Notice, too, how the ranking bends the further it goes. The bottom half of these 12 entries is mostly about human systems, traffic rules, currents everyone knows about, economic fragility built on shallow water, security threats with at least a political off-ramp. The top half strips more and more of that human control away until Drake Passage removes it almost entirely. That progression is the actual argument being made about what dangerous means once you stop treating it as one word for one thing. Dover's danger is arithmetic. Too many vessels in too little space tamed only after a cluster of wrecks forced the issue. Gibraltar's is a layered current system most passengers never think about. Sitting underneath a human tragedy, the shipping statistics don't capture at all. Malacca's is economic fragility, wrapped around shallow water and old, resurgent piracy. Bab el-Mandeb and Hormuz are reminders that geography can be re-weaponized by politics faster than any engineer can respond to it, one currently under attack, the other permanently rehearsing for the possibility. Torres Strait and Sunda Strait show two completely different relationships between shipping and geology, one static and manageable, with the right expertise, one active and capable of almost no warning at all, and both sit inside a wet season that brings its own tropical cyclone risk layered on top of everything else already discussed. A reminder that few of these passages carry only one kind of danger at a time. Even though each has mostly been discussed here one mechanism at a time for clarity's sake. Biscay and Cook Strait are both about weather, but at entirely different scales and time frames. One built from storms that arrive over days, the other from local conditions that can turn in hours. Magellan is a 500-year argument between technology and unchanged natural conditions that technology still hasn't fully won. An argument that accidentally produced the entry ranked above it. Bering is the only passage among these 12 where the danger is still increasing in real time, as ice retreats and traffic grows into a route nobody has fully learned yet. And Drake Passage sits alone at the top precisely because it's the one place where none of the usual tools, regulation, local knowledge, avoidance apply, since there's no land for any of them to attach to. That variety is the actual finding here, more than any individual ranking position. It also means these 12 entries connect to each other in ways a simple countdown doesn't always make obvious. A serious disruption at Bab el Mandeb doesn't just cost shipping lines money on that one route. It pushes more traffic toward the Cape of Good Hope, which means more vessel hours spent in open ocean generally, which quietly raises exposure to exactly the kind of Biscay-style storm risk covered a few entries later. A closure at Hormuz doesn't just threaten oil prices in isolation. It raises the value of every barrel still able to reach market through Malacca, which raises the incentive to keep sailing through Malacca's own piracy and congestion risk rather than pay the price of delay. These 12 passages aren't isolated hazards sitting on a map independently of each other. They're load-bearing pieces of a single global system, and stress on one of them redistributes, rather than disappears, onto the others. Pull on any one thread hard enough, and the slack has to come from somewhere, and it usually comes from whichever other choke point happens to have the least resistance left at that particular moment. Global shipping moves something like 80% of world trade by sea through a small number of choke points that, taken together, decide how much nearly everything costs and how fast it arrives. A fact so easy to forget precisely because it works, day after day, without most of the world ever thinking about the specific stretch of water a given container is crossing at any given moment. The ships keep sailing through all 12 of these passages, and every one of those passages has the wrecks, the death tolls, and the near misses to prove the risk is real. None of that risk is hidden either. Insurers price it, navies patrol it, regulators write entire treaties around it, and crews who work these routes for a living know exactly which of these 12 places make them tighten up on watch and which barely register anymore. The danger persists anyway because the alternative, rerouting the entire structure of global trade around geography that's been the fastest path between 2 points for centuries, costs more than most of the industry has ever been willing to pay. That calculation, danger accepted because the alternative is worse, sits underneath every single ranking decision made here. And it's worth remembering the next time a routine delivery shows up on a doorstep a few days late. Somewhere behind that delay, more often than most people realize, is a strait, a storm, a current, or a decision made by a ship's captain about exactly how much risk this particular crossing was worth. It's worth sitting for a moment with how differently each of these 12 places would answer the question of when they'll stop being dangerous, because the honest answer ranges from already mostly solved to probably never. Dover's danger is closer to solved than not, a problem of coordination that better systems keep chipping away at year over year. Sunda's volcano and Drake's wind and current sit at the other end entirely, indifferent to any system humans could realistically build, exactly as dangerous in 100 years as they are today, unless the physics of the planet itself changes. Most of these 12 fall somewhere in between, improving in places, worsening in others, and that uneven case-by-case reality is a far more honest picture of ocean risk than any single number could give you. A viewer checking back on this same ranking a decade from now would probably find Bab el Mandeb and Hormuz sitting in different positions depending entirely on how their respective conflicts resolve, would likely find Bering climbing rather than holding steady as Arctic shipping matures, and would almost certainly find Drake Passage exactly where it is now, because nothing currently on humanity's engineering roadmap changes what the Southern Ocean does at those latitudes. Dover, Gibraltar, and Malacca would probably still anchor the bottom third, since traffic management and economic fragility are the two problems humanity has gotten genuinely good at managing over the past half-century, even if neither one has ever been fully solved. That's the shape a good ranking should take, mostly stable at the extremes, genuinely contestable in the middle, and honest about which is which. Picture all 12 of these places at once for a moment, existing simultaneously on the ocean right now while you watch this. A pilot boat is threading out to meet an inbound tanker at Torres Strait. A container ship somewhere in Malacca is slowing for a haze bank nobody can see the end of. A cruise ship is either riding the Drake Lake or fighting the Drake Shake, and its passengers already know which one before the captain even makes the announcement. Somewhere off Fujairah, a queue of anchored tankers is waiting out the day's risk assessment before committing to Hormuz. None of that is hypothetical. It's happening on a schedule right now, the same way it happens every single day, and it will keep happening long after this moment passes, whether or not anyone watching ever thinks about these 12 stretches of water again. That's worth noticing, rather than feeling small about, the next time a headline mentions a strait you half recognize. That there's an entire chain of causes, currents, wind, traffic, politics, or geology sitting underneath that one sentence, and that these 12 passages are among the clearest examples of exactly how that chain gets built. If this kind of ranking, real criteria, real evidence, real disagreement about where the line actually falls, is the kind of geography you want more of. Subscribing costs nothing, and it tells us there's an audience for doing this properly, instead of chasing the easiest version of a scary list. Drop a comment on which of these 12 surprised you most, or which one you think we ranked wrong, because there's a genuine argument to be had about several of these placements, and that argument is worth having in public. And if you've personally crossed any of these passages, on a ferry, a cargo ship, a research vessel, a cruise headed toward Antarctica, we'd genuinely like to hear what it was actually like, because first-hand accounts are worth more than any statistic here. A like helps more people find this before their next flight path happens to cross one of these 12 stretches of water. 35,000 feet above a strait most passengers never look down and think twice about.